Stop following Minecraft tutorials and instead let me teach you how to build better houses in Minecraft. See, you can copy this build block for block, but you'll never actually improve. So instead, I'm going to show you the tricks builders use to make any house look amazing. That way you can build any house you want and it'll look great. I'm even going to show you that these tricks actually work by building a house myself at the end of this video. First is location. Now, location is actually a really important detail when you're trying to build something. The reason why is because the biome you decide to build in is going to determine what kind of build style you go with. Not only that, but if you have a bad location, you're probably going to end up with a bad build, unless you spend hours reworking the terrain. So that's why it's super important to find a good location for your build. But how? Well, I recommend you start by choosing which biome you want to build in. For example, if you want to build a log cabin, it might be better to choose something like the taiga biome or a forest instead of choosing the desert or the plains. And that's just because typically log houses are built in the forest. For me, I like to just load up a creative world and find an area that's decently flat. I like areas like this because they're pretty flat. However, as you can see, there's still some elevation in the terrain. And that's good because whatever kind of build you're making, it will 100% look better if it's elevated. For example, having one part of the house start up here while the other ends down here is gonna add some variety and it'll just look better. Don't get me wrong, you can definitely make a cool build on flat terrain. However, they do tend to look better when it's elevated. When you're looking for a place to build, another thing you can think of is the story of your build. Now, some people don't like this as much as others, but I think it's really useful to think about how the people get their food, how they go about their day, and all that kind of stuff. For example, if I was to build a log cabin here, maybe I'd go with the story that this person is living off of fish, which would end up in making me building it closer to the river. So just thinking of small things like that can help you figure out where to put your build. I know it's not for everybody, but trust me, it can help you when you're trying to find that location. For this example, I knew I wanted to build in a plains biome, so I looked around and eventually I found this spot. The terrain is very flat, but I plan to fix that later on. Now, once you found your location, it's time to move on to shape. The shape is usually going to make or break the build, so I would say spend a lot of time mastering the shape of your build just to make sure it looks really good before moving on to the next steps. A trick I like to use is breaking it down into smaller shapes. For example, these are all really simple shapes, but when you mix and match and put them together, you can get something that looks a lot like a house. I find that using this method, I can get some really cool shapes out of my builds, and I get a lot less confused when it comes to figuring out a shape. These are really basic shapes, but you can literally use them to build pretty much anything. Now, when you're actually making the shape of your build, try to make it asymmetrical. For example, this here is very symmetrical, but if we just move this pink area to the side a little bit, now it's asymmetrical because it doesn't look like one side is copied to the other. And trust me, even though this looks kind of weird right now, this makes your builds a lot better. However, when you get into this situation where maybe there's one side that has a little bit more going on than the other, I would recommend doing something to the other side, that way it kind of balances out each other. So just something like that makes it a lot more balanced. So in general, try to make your shapes asymmetrical while keeping balance on both sides. So in general, try to keep your builds asymmetrical while also keeping them balanced. I know it sounds kind of complicated, but trust me, with a bit of practice, it gets a lot easier. And just before moving on, try to keep your shapes as basic as possible in this stage. You want to make sure you leave out all the detail because it can get really confusing if you start adding holes for doors, windows, and stuff like that. So I recommend get a very basic shape first and then add your detail after. Now for the shape of this build, I kept it really simple. I'm going for a medieval house, so I just used 2 cubes and a simple triangle roof. As I said, keep it really simple just like I'm doing, and you can always change up the shape later on if you want. But now let's talk about color. So you have a shape for your build, but you don't know what kind of blocks to use. Well, let me help you. So you have a shape for your build, but now what? Well, now it's time to find your block palette. Usually this will consist of a couple different blocks that will all look good together, and you want to have a different material for each part of the house. For example, in this case, blackstone would probably be for the roof, this spruce would probably be for some beams, maybe mud bricks and mushroom blocks for walls, and you get the point. As I've mentioned way too many times now, I use Pinterest and Instagram all the time to find my inspiration, and that's how I come up with most of my block palettes. So once you find about 6 or more blocks that you like, I'd recommend you start filling in your shape with those basic materials. All you're doing is changing each color of wool for a different block, and keep it as simple as possible for now. I'll usually just fill in my walls with one color, the roof with one color, and I'll keep it very plain, because once I find blocks that I like together, I can move on to making some gradients. Gradients can help you elevate your build to that next level, and all you have to do is look up a site like HueBlocks and it'll literally do all the work for you. You just select which block you want to start and end, and it'll give you everything in between. Now, I would recommend making maybe 3 or 4 block gradients depending on how big your build is, and that's because we're going to use these to make it look like there's shadows in our build. So basically, underneath overhangs, we're going to have some darker blocks. Where it's a very open space, we're going to have some lighter blocks, and that's because because in real life the sun casts its shadows, but in Minecraft it doesn't really work like that. So we have to make our own, and we can do that with gradients. Now hue blocks isn't always the best, so I also like to use another tool called Axiom. Axiom basically lets me generate something that looks like this, and even though it might look like a mess, this is basically a perfect gradient, going from all the dark blocks in Minecraft to the light ones. All you have to do to generate something like this is open this menu, then just make a very big selection. Once that's done, you go to operations and generate color field. I love using this because it allows me to make my gradients on my own. For example, if I want to start with brown wool and go all the way to mushroom block, all I have to do is follow this line and I can pick out some blocks all the way until I get to the mushroom block. And as you can tell by this gradient here, this actually works really well. And what's fun is you can do this with absolutely any block in the game. Coloring the build takes by far the longest amount of time, so I like to spend a good amount just figuring out which blocks to use. And eventually, after a bit of messing around, I came up with this block palette and these gradients to go along with it. Moving on, now that we have our shape and it's all colored in, we can talk about the details. Now details are super simple. It can literally be a flower pot, a pile of wood, or even just a lightning rod. But details really help your build come together and it adds a lot of life. So whether it's a flower pot, a hanging sign, some lanterns, maybe candles, or even a small wagon, these are all things that can help add life to your build, and it's the real secret to making your builds look better. You could literally detail a house forever, so I recommend you don't overdo it, but you can even do things like adding moss to a wall to make it look like it's old and vines are growing on it. You can add some cracked stone bricks to make it look like it's crumbling, or even a simple gradient like this to show that the build is really old. For the details, I made a lot of gradients, as you'll see, and you can see how I'm using them to create artificial shadows. I used frog lights here to symbolize the sun. That way I have a point of reference for where the light is coming from. But you can see that the build is really starting to shape up. So now your shape looks great, you have a lot of color, and your details are looking great, but the build still looks kind of out of place. And that's because if you want your build to really look good, you have to integrate it with the terrain. Now of course this is really self-explanatory, but anything from a simple rock to even maybe some trees, some grass, some flowers, this part is all about trying to include your build with the terrain. So try to implement a lot of grass and a lot of things growing maybe on the side of the walls of the house. Maybe try adding a couple of trees near it and try to make it look like it actually belongs there instead of just being in the middle of nowhere. It's kind of hard to explain, so let me show you how I did it. This is my favorite part of any build. I like to build rocks, trees, and spam some grass along with a couple of flowers. You also can't go wrong with a road, so I added that in, and I honestly think that this build turned out great. It's a lot simpler than some of my other builds, but I still really like it and I think it looks good. All that's missing is an interior on this build, so let me know in the comments if you guys want a video on that. If this video helped you, consider subscribing. I'm posting great videos like this every single week, and with that, have a great rest of your day.